flesh. You know, God unites the first two human beings in a wedding and commands them to leave their father and mother and then to cleave to their spouse. So our focus today will be leaving and cleaving is our topic. We'll be looking at it. You know, you think about it, these words that he gave to this couple, it was actually a couple that had no biological parents. So did you ever think about that? That, you know, to leave your father and your mother, and he's telling them, well, they really didn't have a father and mother. So really, this was probably more for them in instructing their kids and their grandkids and on down the line. It wasn't so much about Adam and Eve's marriage, but it was more on the institution of marriage and maybe how they, as parents, were going to need to treat it down the road a little bit. So let us take a look at this morning, leaving and cleaving. And I think as we look at this verse, there's two points that we can bring out from this. And the first point is that marriage is a priority relationship that trumps your relationship with your parents. So as we leave the parents and we cleave to the spouse, marriage is the number one priority. Gentlemen, there can only be one first lady. And that first lady changes. You know, the word leave does not mean that you have to move thousands of miles away. Although in some cases that may be beneficial. We recognize that it is not necessary. This leaving, this focus on leaving and cleaving is more of an emotional leaving and cleaving. You know, leaving and cleaving is the idea that no relationship apart from your relationship with God is more important than that of your spouse. Now, I realize that sometimes things are easier said than done. Because in practice, we do realize that our parents bring wisdom and advice. And so sometimes there may be times when your parents have wisdom and advice to go in one direction, but that advice is different than what your spouse would want to take you. And so you're in a situation, well, do I give the spouse first priority when in fact you realize that maybe your parents have some very wise information? And so it becomes a little bit cloudy and a little bit more difficult as to this leaving and cleaving and how we practice it and how we live it out. And sometimes, though, as parents, we do want to give them advice. We do want to help them in their situations. But if it gets to the point where your counsel is obviously not welcomed by them, then maybe as parents, what I'm suggesting is we might at times have to let our children learn the hard way. We have to give them the freedom to make mistakes and to find things out for their own and to live with the consequence of those mistakes. And so there's a balance here on this leaving and cleaving, but at some point we do need to let them go. Now, leaving also does not mean that you abandon your parents. You know, as they age and as they become more dependent on their children, and as children, you need to be there for them, even if maybe your spouse is not all that keen about them. So that is not what leaving and cleaving means. We still have that responsibility to help them out. But what leaving and cleaving does mean is that parents need to let go. Let the kids make their own decisions, and we as parents, we must seek God's wisdom as to the best way to give advice and to influence them in a positive way while still giving them their freedom to make their decisions and their choices. So that's the first part. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The leaving and cleaving, I think, indicates to us that marriage is the priority relationship, and there can only be one first lady. I think the second thing we can focus on in this passage is in regard to the timing of leaving and cleaving. Leaving and cleaving The emphasis in this text as we look at it is a young man and a woman. They leave their family of origin and they immediately enter into the marriage. That's the implication, at least, as we look at the words. And throughout history, leaving and cleaving has been almost simultaneous. Once they leave the house, it is to get married and to start a family and to start work. Well, that is not the case today in our culture. In our culture today, young people are leaving home and living single for longer periods of time. And so now there is a large gap between leaving and between cleaving. And because of this gap, there are some changes and some consequences of this that have come as a result of that make it a little harder to live according to God's plan and to God's design. So I want to take a look at that. I mean, really today, young people are leaving home and living single for longer periods of time. Now, scripturally and historically, there are really two life phases. At least as Scripture puts it, there's childhood and there's adulthood. And if we look at our second reading today in 1 Corinthians, Paul describes this transition. He says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And so he speaks about this transition from childhood to manhood. And traditionally, that child to manhood transition involves, well, let's just say 5 steps. Leaving home, completing an apprenticeship or a formal education, which used to be high school a few generations. Now, obviously, college is extending that. Finding employment, getting married, and starting a family. And in generations past, these 5 adulthood milestones happened quickly, if not simultaneously. You left home prepared for the responsibility of work, wife, and the world. Parents back then sent children out as adults, not on a journey to become one. And as we've indicated already today, and I think as everyone realizes, that's not the case today. And there are implications to that. And probably the biggest one is this. We are sending our 20-year-olds out into the world. We're asking them to live out the part of their lives where their sexual drive is the strongest in their life, yet we are asking them to remain single and to remain abstinent. How is that working? Probably not too well. And no wonder there is such a promotion in our culture of free and open relationships. And for those who aren't willing to openly indulge in acting out their desires through other relationships, there are others who act them out through movies and through photographs on the internet. That sure sounds like a good way to lead to a good, healthy relationship down the road. Again, I think you see some of the consequences of this delayed cleaving as it impacts our culture today. I want to ask the question, why do kids wait so long today? And these are just some ideas, nothing, really not all that scriptural, but just maybe to talk about this issue today. Do they feel that they're missing out on something, that if they leave and cleave early, they'll be missing out? They want to explore what is out there to taste and sample a bit before they cleave. Is that the issue? Or maybe the youth are coming from a broken home, and as a result, they are afraid to commit because they know firsthand the pain that can come from a cleaving that has been broken. Or maybe it's just the case that our culture is becoming so corrupt that maybe a Christian young person today just has a hard time finding someone out there equally yoked and equally interested in serving God and believing in God. And so the numbers just become smaller and it becomes more difficult to find someone, on top of the idea of someone who you are attracted to and would be interested in. Or maybe our culture is just too easy on our kids. You're thinking, what's that? Well, let me explain. You know, there is some scientific literature out there, and I can't quote where it is today, but I remember hearing this at one point in the past, that says that young women who live under very stressful environments, and when I say stressful, I'm talking like third world